On a Tuesday morning in October of 1991, Frank Belk stood at the edge of the Chickamauga Creek in Catoosa County, Georgia, and watched his career sink into the mud. 4 days earlier, his company's Manitowoc 4100 crawler crane, 180 tons of steel, hydraulics, and lattice boom, had punched through what the soil report called stable ground and dropped into the soft riverbank clay beneath. The machine had gone in fast. One moment it was rigging a precast bridge beam. The next, the left crawler had disappeared below the surface. Within 6 hours, both tracks were gone. By morning, the cab was at ground level. Every hour it sank another inch. Frank had tried everything. On the first day, 2 Caterpillar D10 bulldozers chained to the crane's frame and pulled until their own tracks spun uselessly in the wet clay. The chains held. The crane didn't move. On the second day, a rigging company from Chattanooga brought a 60-ton hydraulic pulling unit and anchored it to a concrete deadman block 400 feet away. The cable stretched, the anchor shifted 3 feet, and the crane sank another 8 inches. On the third day, Frank called the manufacturer's recovery team. They looked at the site for 2 hours and said the same thing his engineers had already said. "You need a sky crane. There's one available in Minneapolis, $18,000 an hour plus mobilization." Frank did the math. By the time a sky crane reached Georgia, the Manitowoc would be underground. He was standing with his engineers going over options that all cost more than the crane itself when the sound reached them. A deep, rhythmic diesel knock, slow and heavy, coming from the access road. Not the sound of modern equipment. Something older. Something that seemed to shake the ground at a lower frequency than anything on site. Then Walter Crum's 1950 Northwest 80D cable crane came over the rise. Let me tell you about Walter Crum, because you cannot understand what happened next without understanding the man. Walter was 74 years old and had operated a limestone quarry in Walker County for 41 years. Not a big quarry, never more than 12 employees, but a productive one. Walter had built it from a single drilling rig his father left him in 1952 into an operation that supplied crushed stone to half the construction projects in northwest Georgia. He knew rock, he knew ground, and he knew equipment the way a surgeon knows anatomy. The Northwest 80D had been his primary lifting machine since 1964, when he bought it used from a highway contractor in Alabama for $4,200. He'd used it to set quarry machinery, lift compressors into confined spaces, and move equipment that no modern crane could reach, because the 80D's footprint was small enough to get where the big machines couldn't go. He'd stopped using it commercially in 1985 when he bought a newer crane, but he'd never sold it. He maintained it. He fired it up once a month. He told anyone who asked that there would come a day when nothing else would do. Now Walter drove it down the access road at 4 miles an hour, the steel crawler tracks biting into the gravel, the lattice boom swaying gently with the terrain. Behind the cab, 2 drums of heavy cable rode on a custom-built trailer. Walter's son, Dennis, followed in a pickup loaded with rigging equipment. Frank Belk watched the machine approach with an expression that went through several stages: confusion, recognition, dismissal. "What is that?" he said. His site foreman, a man named Ott Simmons, squinted. "That's a Northwest 80D cable crane, late 40s, early 50s vintage." "How much does it lift?" "Rated at 40 tons at short radius." Frank looked at the Manitowoc sunk in the mud. 180 tons. He looked back at the 80D. He started to laugh. Walter parked the crane at the edge of the site and climbed down. He moved without hurrying. He walked to where Frank stood, looked at the sunken Manitowoc, looked at the failed bulldozers, looked at the ground between them. He said nothing for almost a minute. "I can pull that out," he said finally. Frank's laughter got louder. The engineers exchanged glances. Someone on the crew coughed into his hand. "With that," Frank pointed at the 80D, "that machine is 40 years old. It lifts 40 tons. I've got 180 tons of crane in the mud. My own equipment couldn't touch it. What makes you think some antique is going to do better?" Walter looked at Frank without any change in expression. "Your equipment pulls in straight lines," he said. "Hydraulics push and pull on one axis. That works fine on solid ground. But that crane isn't being held by weight alone. It's being held by suction. Clay suction. Riverbank clay grabs like a fist. You're not fighting gravity, you're fighting vacuum. Your bulldozers tried to overcome it all at once. They couldn't. Nobody can. And you can. I'm not going to overcome it all at once. I'm going to break it." Frank stopped laughing. "Break it." Clay suction breaks when you introduce movement, not straight-line pull oscillation. My crane uses a cable drum system with independent speed control. I can pulse the load, apply force, release, apply, release. Each pulse breaks a little more suction. By the time I'm pulling with full load, the vacuum is already compromised. Walter nodded toward the mud. "Your machines are designed to protect themselves. When a hydraulic system senses overload, it relieves pressure. Mine doesn't know when to quit. It just pulls." Frank looked at his engineers. One of them shrugged with the expression of a man who had no better idea. "If it breaks down trying," Frank said, "you haul it off my site yourself." "Fair," Walter said, and turned back to the 80D. "Let me tell you about the setup, because that's where 40 years of experience showed itself." Walter didn't rush. He spent the first hour walking the site. He tested the ground with a steel rod at 20 different points. He studied the angle of the sunken crane's boom, the direction of the initial failure, the slope of the riverbank. He walked the perimeter of the mud zone 3 times, pushing his boot heel into the clay at intervals. Then he began positioning. He didn't anchor opposite the crane and pull directly. He set the 80D at a 30-degree angle to the sunken machine's centerline, offset oblique. His son Dennis ran cables from the 80D's main drum to the Manitowoc's frame. Threading through a pair of snatch blocks, Walter drove into the ground himself with a sledgehammer. When the rigging was complete, the geometry looked wrong to everyone watching. The pull angle seemed counterproductive. Frank's lead engineer walked over. "You're not pulling it straight out, you're pulling it sideways." "I'm pulling it at the angle the ground wants to release it," Walter said. "The machine went in straight. That means the suction is equal on all sides. Pull it straight and you're fighting all of it at once. Pull it oblique and you start peeling the suction from one side first. Pressure finds the path of least resistance. So do I." The engineer looked at the rigging for a long moment. Then he walked away without saying anything else. Walter climbed into the 80D's cab. He checked his drums. He checked his cable runs. He let the diesel warm for 4 minutes, not 3, not 5. He knew this engine. Then he engaged the drum. The cable went taut. The lattice boom flexed slightly, absorbing load. For a moment, nothing happened. Walter released tension, applied it again, released, applied. The pulse was slow and deliberate, not jerking but breathing. Load and release, each cycle lasting about 8 seconds. On the 4th pulse, something changed in the mud around the Manitowoc. A faint tremor in the surface. A line of small cracks appearing in the clay 6 feet from the sunken track. On the 6th pulse, the mud at the Manitowoc's left side made a sound. A low, wet, sucking groan that everyone on site heard and nobody had heard before. Frank Belk stopped talking. The engineers stopped talking. The entire crew went silent. Walter kept pulsing. On the 9th cycle, the Manitowoc moved, 2 inches to the left, barely visible, but it moved. On the 11th cycle, it moved a foot. The mud was releasing. Not all at once, one section at a time, exactly as Walter had described. The suction breaking in panels, the clay losing its grip sequentially as the oblique pull peeled it away from one side to the other. By the 14th cycle, the Manitowoc's left track was visible above the surface. By the 20th, both tracks were clear. Walter applied steady tension then. No more pulsing. and the ADD pulled the 180-ton crane across the mud to solid ground in one long, slow, continuous movement that took 11 minutes. When it was done, the site was completely silent for 5 full seconds. Then the crew erupted. Men were shouting, pointing, grabbing each other's arms. A man near the back of the crowd threw his hard hat in the air. Someone started clapping and the rest followed, building into something that echoed off the tree line across the creek. Frank Belk stood absolutely still. He looked at the Manitowoc sitting on solid ground, muddy and battered but intact. He looked at the 1950 Northwest ADD, its diesel still running at idle, Walter climbing down from the cab without drama. He looked at the path the crane had taken through the clay, the evidence of a plan that had worked precisely as described. He didn't say a word for a long time. Walter walked over to where Dennis was already beginning to coil cable. Frank followed him. "How much do I owe you?" Frank said. Walter didn't look up from the cable. "Donate to the Walker County Vocational School. They're trying to keep equipment programs running. The county cut their budget." "How much of a donation? What did 4 days of delays cost you?" Frank thought about it. "Close to $400,000. Then give them $15,000. That'll fund their program for 2 years. Frank reached for his checkbook without hesitating. Before he wrote the check, he looked at Walter one more time. "I laughed at you in front of my whole crew." Walter tied off the cable end and looked up. "You did." "I was wrong." "You weren't wrong to be skeptical. You'd never seen it done. There's a difference between wrong and uninformed." Walter picked up the next cable length. "Being uninformed is fixable. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end at the riverbank." Frank Belk finished the Chickamauga Creek Bridge project on time. He framed Walter's invoice, a single hand-written note for $0, and hung it in his office. He told the story at every industry conference he attended for the next 15 years. Not a flattering version of himself, the honest version, including the part where he laughed. In 1994, when a highway project in Dade County had a piece of equipment stuck in a situation that Frank's engineers said required equipment that didn't exist, Frank made one phone call. Walter Crum was there the next morning. Walter retired from the quarry in 1997. He sold the operation to a regional aggregate company, but he kept 2 things: the property and the Northwest ADD. He maintained it until 2004, when his health made it impossible to operate. His son Dennis took over the maintenance. He fires it up once a month. He takes it to equipment shows in the summer. People stop and stare and ask about the boom geometry and the dual drum system, and Dennis tells them the story of the Chickamauga Creek, and they shake their heads the way people do when something sounds impossible but isn't. Walter Crum died in 2009 at the age of 91. Frank Belk drove from Atlanta to Walker County for the funeral. He told anyone who would listen that Walter had saved his business. Not just the crane, the business. The delays were destroying the project schedule, the client relationships, the company's reputation for getting things done. An old man with a 40-year-old machine did what $500,000 of modern equipment couldn't, Frank said. And he explained exactly why before he did it. "I just wasn't smart enough to listen the first time." The Northwest ADD sits in Dennis Crum's equipment shed in Walker County. It's been there for over 70 years now. Started once a month, kept in perfect working order. Ready. Because Walter believed something that he never had to say out loud. You could hear it in the way he maintained that machine, the way he fired it up every 30 days without fail, the way he drove at 4 miles an hour down a highway to a construction site where everyone was already laughing before he stopped the engine. He believed that the right tool in the right hands, with the right understanding, doesn't become obsolete. It just waits for the problem that proves it right. The engineers said nothing could pull it out. The old man fired up his 1950 crane, explained the physics in plain language to people who had engineering degrees, and pulled it out in 20 cycles of a cable drum. That's what happens when experience meets the problem that textbooks forgot to solve.